to tell her, look, this is your natural role. This is what you've been doing all the time. You've always been doing this. You've always stayed in the home. But the point was that earlier, the home was a very different place. And no woman who stayed in the home could afford to be a lady of leisure. Right? And even when agriculture, even when hunting and gathering became agriculture, women worked along with men on farms and fields. The house was not a place in which one completely relaxed. All production activity happened within the house. Carpentry, pottery, weaving garments, stitching, making clothes, whatever it was, small artisanal crafts, trades, happened with the entire family pitching in, including small children. So if all production activity took place within the house was a place of work. So then who was the housewife? Once again, in agricultural society, there was no housewife. So I'm going to take that story forward into industrial society and say it was with the birth of the factory-based revolution, what we call the industrial revolution that started in England from the mid-18th century onwards, that gained steam in many other North American countries, in Europe and so on. Factories opened up. Factories opened up asking for a male population, for a male workforce. Then it became necessary to pay the male workforce a minimal salary so that profits could expand and could be reinvested. Now, how do you pay a male workforce or any workforce a minimal salary and expect them to survive and come back the next day to work and the next week and the next month? How do you expect them to do that? Because you expect that they in turn will survive because of the unpaid labor services that is produced by a woman worker within their house who does not think of herself as a worker but is trained, but is indoctrinated to think of herself as a wife, a sister, a daughter, a mother who's performing these services out of motherly love or sisterly love for the men of her family. Because if she is allowed to see that the work that she does within the home, right, all the work in converting raw food into cooked food, all the work in keeping the house warm, in stitching his clothes, in keeping the house clean, in taking care of small children, in giving birth to them, in taking care of the elderly, in taking care of anyone who falls ill within the house, if she is allowed to see that as work, because work, as you know in economics, is anything that, any good or service that fulfills a human need is work. Okay? It's not anything that enters the market and earns a wage. That's not the definition. The textbook definition of work is if you are providing a good or a service that fulfills a basic human need when you're working. Right? Which means that everything that happens within, in and around the household has to be seen as work. But if you actually see that as work and give her a salary and decide, oh, she must also earn a wage because she is working, then obviously you cannot underpay the man who enters your factory. You can only underpay him by telling him, this is your wage, but that's all right because you have your wife, the housewife, providing all these services for you, and that is not work. So I think one of the lessons that we seem to have forgotten in history is that we evolved as a society. The Industrial Revolution became possible on profits that were generated through the factory system, despite the minimal wages paid to a male working force, only because there was an unpaid, invisible, completely unpaid female working force working within homes, right? Who were then called about 300, 400 years back. The term housewife originated. It's only 300, 400 years old. And already we think that women have always been housewives, right? But there was never a period in history in which human society survived without the labor of women. As it happens for 400 years, women have been taught to think of themselves as non-laboring if they don't step out of the house and earn a wage from outside the house. Women have been taught to think of themselves as merely wives and daughters and mothers as being housewives. So that is one of the fundamental myths on which the modern factory system that we are all now a part of has been based. Unfortunately, that myth has grown to such proportions that even on International Working Women's Day, we can afford to forget the fact that we have always been working, and before we are mothers or wives or sisters, we are fundamentally part of the working class, no matter which social strata women belong to. So I want to sort of emphasize that point. I can't, I don't want you to ever forget that point. Now what I want to also add along with that is to bring the story to today, to the day. And both of them, both Vaigai and Ms. Rita spoke very beautifully about the anxieties and the guilt and the conflicting emotions and the emotional trauma that women face when they enter the labor market. All of us are in the labor market. I'm a teacher, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher. I work in an institution called IIT Madras. I put my labor out in the market, I receive a wage, a fairly good wage, thanks to the whatever latest pay commission. All of you are workers, you are in a protected job environment, you are part of the state structure. So when we enter the labor force, we don't do it forgetting the fact, like she very rightly said, that we are wives and mothers. We are not allowed to forget that fact. Sometimes I wish we could forget that fact. It would be good to forget it also, right? But always to remember, especially when you take maternity leave, that you come back leaving a small child at home. Or when you have older ailing parents, to remember that their needs cannot be attended to when you are at work. That burden, that psychological stress and toll that women bear constantly, the fact that you might have to take more leave than your male employees. This is particularly the case in the private sector. In fact, I was part of a small exercise to understand how IT companies, the so-called modern sector, give performance assessment grades. And one of our shocking findings was that any woman who takes maternity leave, just before she takes it, when it's known that she's going to take maternity leave, her team leader will give her a D or an E grade, which is like the lowest grade for assessment of performance. When she comes back from maternity leave, she will once again get an E grade. Now, much of one's pay, bonus, self-esteem at work is tied to these performance assessment measures within the private sector. This is not something that is being challenged within the private sector either. There is a notion that, yeah, obviously when a woman has a baby and then she will take leave, then she won't stay on weekends, then she'll want to go at 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. She won't do overtime. She must obviously get that E grade. So which means for that woman, she cannot compete with her male co-worker as an equal. She must always feel apologetic about taking time off to do the work that she is required to do, that she is not ever allowed to forget is her primary responsibility. So this kind of stress and trauma that women face, am I a worker or am I a mother? Can I be both a fiercely competitive and ambitious woman worker at the same time as I can be a caring mother? Am I allowed to be both? A woman has to actually think that, whereas a man simply does not have to forget because he has a wife at home after all, right? He can forget that he's anything but a machine who works with work identities in place. Now, what I want to say is there's a lot of writing in the media, especially, which is talking to women about, yes, of course you have these pressures, but you must rise above it. You must remember, you must build your capacities. You must manage time better. You must prioritize better. You must communicate better. All of that is fine. And maybe it is to an individual woman who's struggling with this stress and who's reading it. It makes some sense to her. Certainly it does. It's comforting to read it. But what it does primarily is to put the focus on the individual. It is to make that individual woman feel even more inadequate than she's already feeling. Even more guilty, even more anxious. Oh, maybe I'm not prioritizing. Maybe I'm not communicating well enough. Whereas what I say is this is not an individual problem. Do not individualize this problem. There is something that is fundamentally wrong with a social structure, with an economy, with a government, with a state, with us as a civilization. If women are not allowed to be simultaneously comfortable and joyful and at peace and happy when they are both wives and mothers on the one hand and fiercely competitive career women on the other hand. If we are not able to reconcile these identities in a very harmonious way, then the problem is not ours. It's not an individual problem. The problem is a crisis of that economic system that you and I are a part of. And that problem has to be collectively addressed by that system that we are a part of. That includes our employers, whether it's the private sector or corporates or it is the government. That includes households, certainly, with men stepping up and taking more responsibility for child care and elder care and cooking and washing and cleaning and everything else and managing. Or if somebody else, you're paying somebody to do it for you, arranging that household arrangement, right? With men stepping up and saying, that's my work and I have no shame in doing it, right? So households, employers, and at the same time, obviously, the state as well, right? So these entities have to come together in order to make women see that the anxiety and guilt and emotional trauma they often face at an individual level is not an individual problem. In fact, it's one of the legacies of the fact that this birth of the housewife, that even as we have entered the paid workforce, like all of us have today, we are never allowed to remember that our primary identity is something else. And this can only be a secondary identity, right? Whereas I find that deeply problematic. I think all of us, men and women alike, have identities of worker, of boss, of manager, of daughter, of son, of father, of son-in-law. And we must work to build a society in which all of us are able to balance these identities fairly easily the way men are able to alone today.
Okay, so I think there's just two more things that I would like to say, and once again I don't want to take up too much time.
Vaiga has done a fantastic job of introducing the issue of violence against women. I just want to add to that by saying, let's never forget, because all of us probably have young sons and young daughters, younger siblings, we're all women in the workforce. Let's not forget for even a minute that the reason there is so much violence against women in India is not because the police are inefficient. It's not because the courts are not working as well as they ought to. It's because we as a society have given consent to the idea of violence against women. Right? Somewhere we have said it's okay, it's alright, chalta hai. Maybe a horrific rape like Nirbhaya's is not alright. But the everyday groping, fumbling, teasing of women, texting women, sending obscene messages to women, nudging women, marking women, a girl walks past, a group of boys immediately will hoot and whistle and clap and cheer and perform for each other, you know that, right? And give her marks and grade her and use adjectives to describe her body parts. There is a tremendous amount of social permission for that, social endorsement of that behavior. If anybody you would speak to would say, ஆம்பளைங்கன்னா இப்படிதான் இருப்பாங்க, வாலிப விளையாட்டு இப்படிதான் இருக்கும். அது ரொம்ப தப்பு. அது அந்த மாதிரி இருக்கவே இருக்காது. இருக்க வேண்டிய அவசியமும் இல்லை. எல்லா ஊர்லயும் ஆம்பளைங்க இருக்காங்க. ஆனா நிறைய ஊர்ல ஒரு பொண்ணு தனியா ரோட்ல நடக்கும்போது 4 பேர் விசில் அடிச்சாங்கன்னா அடுத்த நிமிஷம் போலீஸ் வருவாங்க, மத்தவங்க எல்லாரும் சேர்ந்து அவங்களை அடிச்சு போடுவாங்க. அப்ப what is it that some societies, South Asian societies in particular, permit is a certain peculiar kind of street harassment or sexual harassment in public spaces, which is not allowed socially to exist in many parts of the world. Let's keep that in mind. And the roots, if we were to go to the roots of what it is that sustains violence, what is it that feeds violence against women, it's the fact that we permit ourselves and our children to think that men are power holders and women are not. To think that women are